you as a church leader do not need to stake a firm position on something where it's not clear and where the Bible doesn't speak.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to The Narrative. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and some rando joining us in the studio today.
It's all happening.
You guys miss me?
Miracles
David
do happen.
Mahan, the prodigal son, returns to bring the band back together at
That's
long
right.
last.
Indeed,
family.
we can all be on the same podcast together. We actually do like each other for the most part.
It has been light on insults around CCV without the
exactly.
three of us in the office at the same time. But
yes.
Good to see you again, David. And you were away while some pretty big news broke. We talked about HB 68 last week. Aaron and I did. And because you put so much work into that bill, we wanted to give you a chance just to reflect on it and what that news was like to receive. I know you were on vacation when you got it, but to get that news, that had to be pretty special.
I was all the way on vacation. I turned off all of my signal notifications. But I was literally standing in the beach watching my kids parasail and throw up all over the place. And so I get back to the beach chair, and Alani's like, "Answer your phone, we've got news." But yeah, it was amazing. I was really surprised by Holbrook's response to the whole thing. Had no idea that this was coming, and really his responses were kind of really detailed about how awesome a bill it is. And, I know you guys kind of went over some of this stuff yesterday, but the court finds that upon weighing the evidence received in the trial, it's limited to minors. Moreover, the medical ban, I hate that he called it that, carries with the undeniable risk and permanent outcomes, right? So he talks about how other countries have, stepped away from what they were doing years. They got us by 20 years. So I just really he didn't have to go that detailed. And so it just blew me away. And then, we kind of got when I got back, we got to talking with Aaron, and he was like, do you guys remember doing a piece where we broke down all the web pages, of like Children's Hospital and things like that?
Because they would say in committee hearings, we're not doing these services. We're not doing any of this. And I remember you guys are sitting in committee, like literally pulling up their website while their lobbyists are testifying. Like, you say right here that you're doing this. Like,
so we had 4 or 5 pages of basically just screenshots of all the details of what they do. And so we kind of went back through and. Every last one of them, from Cincinnati Children's to Nationwide Children's, Nationwide, they just completely got rid of their whole sections on adolescent medicine and endocrinology.
And endocrinology is, think hormones and puberty blockers.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, the puberty blockers and everything. Many of them took off all the surgery recommendations that they said,
they weren't doing.
Yeah, we really blew that up. But yeah, it was just amazing to see, and this was, we always talk about how it was David and Goliath, but to see where they were forced to actually take this mutilation and harm that was going on to children off of their websites because of something that you all were a part of is just amazing.
Yeah, no, my favorite one is on Cincinnati Children's Hospitals, where it talks on their hormone treatment area. It says at Cincinnati Children's, we are unable to provide hormones to minors due to Ohio law. Right. Again, like that's just, I want to get that framed and put up on our walls because, one, that like David said, it's certainly a David and Goliath situation to get a multi-billion-dollar corporation like Cincinnati Children's Hospital to change their, basically stop, let's talk really bluntly the way they look at this, stop releasing a product that they have in hormones for kids. But, the other side of this is, again, this is as we're coming up to a big election, when we're dealing with people saying Christians shouldn't be involved in elections, keep Christians out, I have people in mind like Phil Vischer who talks about, why should, Christians don't really have an impact when they get involved in these areas. And it's like, no, this is because Christians spoke out. And again, really, it was only Christians at the beginning. Now you're seeing people come around. You're seeing people like Joe Rogan and other folks come out and actually start condemning this stuff. But it was Christians that led the way on this,
Yeah, it's good to keep the receipts as well along the way.
Yes,
so you
exactly,
can measure those victories, and that could end up being a common theme in our podcast today as we talk about keeping receipts, because there was a report that I believe was in Cleveland.com, Cleveland Plain Dealer, about the Ed Choice program, which you want to talk about media spin at its finest. This was quite a take on the Ed Choice program and the payouts. They were saying that it cost Ohio almost $1 billion, but there's some interesting math going on there, isn't there, Aaron?
Right. I mean, this is Laura Hancock, who's at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Cleveland.com. This is what we've come to expect from them, and they've been carrying the teachers' unions water on the whole school choice debate for years, and it's what we've seen them do time and time again, where they're like, oh my gosh, we're taking $1 billion out of public schools to do this. No, again, this is Corey DeAngelis' stuff. Is this money for public schools or is it for kids? Right? Why are we sending $9 billion into education every year? Is it to fund government bureaucracies, or is it to fund children? And the answer,
funding education. That's for sure.
Right. Well, when it's going to a lot of these government schools, it's certainly not. But with this, what you have with Ed Choice now is you actually have money being tied to the child, right? So when the child is saying, I'm going to go here, they have the option to actually make sure money is going with them to help pay for their legit education, right? Not like, Youngstown City Schools, which, I mean, this was a report from 4 or 5 years ago, but showed, 30% of the nearly $20,000 at the time we were sending to that school was actually going into the classroom, actually going to the children. The rest was going to bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. I mean, it shows the brokenness of this. And so, there was just a few things that jumped out to me. First, there's a bigger math issue here I wanted to tackle, but the thing that really jumped out as I dropped my kids off at school for the first day at school today, and they go to Tree of Life, and we love Tree of Life. And Tree of Life is one of the larger Christian schools in town, in the state. And they scrap by, right? They really are doing everything they can to make every dollar go as far as they can. And, it's one of the things you just love about it. You drive through the school, and you just see all of the ways that they stretch dollars to make them work, right? They don't have a gymnasium, right? They don't have a big cafeteria, right? Kids have to bring their own lunches in, all that kind of stuff. On average, teachers start at a typical Christian school, and we know this because we run the largest network of Christian schools in the state, in the Ohio Christian Education Network. On average, even our big Christian schools start paying teachers at about $30,000 to $32,000 a year, compared to a teacher that starts in a public schools would start at $55,000 to $70,000 per year. And somebody in this, one of the teachers unions lobbyists that they interviewed in this story, said that the voucher is a big money maker for these schools. Nobody using the voucher. None of these schools. Again, Columbus Public gets $24,646 per kid. These private schools get $6,400 per kid on the voucher. But here's the real math, though, that they hid from you, right? So they're saying that this voucher costs $966 million to the state. Well, on average, Ohio spends $14,000 per kid. The way the formula works in Ohio is it's not a direct one-to-one equation. There's kids in the inner city schools tend to get more money per kid. Kids in suburban schools get less. That's why your property taxes tend to be higher in the suburbs. But on average, it's around $14,000 per kid in the state. If the teachers unions were to get their way, and we were to eliminate the voucher program, and all of these kids were to have to go back into the public schools. And let me be clear, they'd have to go back to the public school. The vast majority of these kids would have to go back to the public schools, because the schools would not be able to stay open, because most of these parents wouldn't be able to afford to keep this open. Even if that individual parent, say there's a handful of parents in that school that could afford to pay that private school tuition themselves, the school, the financial model wouldn't work, because all the other kids who can't afford it would have to leave, right? So if these guys were to get their way, if their ed choice lawsuit that's going through the state court right now were to win and to shut down the voucher program, it would instead cost the state over nearly $2.2 billion to move all of these kids back into the government schools. So yes, indeed, nearly $966 million, nearly $1 billion is going to help educate these kids. It's saving the taxpayers over 1.2, double that, for them to be there. And by the way, they're actually getting an education, right? What are we talking about?
And the public schools keep the local funds.
Right.
It stays with the school even though they're not educating the kids.
Right.
But the thing that blew me away is how they look at it as a negative.
Right.
That more parents have chosen to take their kids and take advantage of the voucher. That means that so many more parents were displeased with the public system.
Right.
They were not getting their needs met. They were doing a terrible job meeting the needs of their constituents. So that's also a piece that wasn't spoken.
Nobody wants to ask that question. Why are why
are they leaving?
If the public schools are so great, if they're doing everything they should do, why would parents want out? And they don't want to look at that question.
Yeah, and as you read through this story, the one piece that jumped out to me as we got to this table that talked about the different kinds of scholarships, like they're framing this as a hit piece on ed choice expansion specifically, which was passed in last year's state budget. But then if you look at the table, the ed choice expansion accounts for $405 million of this overall number, the $966 million that they're painting as this boogeyman. Like
That's right.
It's not even half of that number that was from the ed choice expansion. And they're making it seem like, oh, it's because this ed choice expansion happened that the state spent almost $1 billion on private school education.
Again, the biggest takeaway here is you just can't trust these people anymore. They're just not going to give you the right information.
No, that's right. Yeah, they don't want to acknowledge the autism scholarship and the John Peterson scholarship, which is another special needs scholarship. So again, you have a situation in with these kids who they have very specific needs, right? Their local public school can't meet them or is not meeting them. The parents who are the ones actually involved in that child's life has realized they cannot, their needs aren't being met, and are taking their kids out to send them someplace else. And that's what these teachers unions advocates want to do.
And as we continue our theme of keeping the receipts, we're going to have a conversation today with Megan Basham about her new book called Shepherds on Sale. And if anybody has been paying any kind of attention to social media or just the church world in general, this has been throwing gasoline on the fire or kicking over the hornet's nest, whichever metaphor you prefer. But it'll be an interesting conversation.
It's gonna be great. I have so much respect for Megan, and I'll just say, watching all of the backlash against Megan, two things came to mind. One, something that Pastor David Forbes, who's on our board, told us is that the closer you get to the target, the heavier the fire comes. And the things that you see Megan expose in her book, Shepherds for Sale, are things that I think, one, experientially, everybody who's been paying attention has witnessed, right? And I think two, the bigger thing, a lot of folks are really taking issue with Megan's honest reporting about folks that have really embraced woke culture, or maybe they embraced sort of the COVID panic, but then never actually came out and said, I was wrong about that, right? I think you look at some of the stuff around Francis Collins and folks like that who were really pimping a lot of pastors out there to push COVID vaccines, and framing it up as an issue of you don't love your neighbor, you're not being a faithful Christian if you're not getting the vax. There's that whole aspect of it, but then the part that isn't getting nearly the buzz that I think is the biggest part of her book, and we've talked about it here on the podcast before, is how George Soros and a number of these leftist causes are funding evangelical ministries in particular to drive their political agenda. And Megan's work here is going to be, I'm always hesitant. A lot of times there's always new books coming out, and there's always, with things that we'll act like things are very important that are hitting the shelves. But I really do think Megan's book, Shepherds for Sale, is going to be one of these things years from now. We're going to look back and see how important this book was, as is the book we talked about last week, Pro-Child Politics, that Katie Faust did. So it's going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it, and we'll have it for you coming up on The Narrative. Hey, narrative listeners. You know, Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian chamber of commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org. Welcome back to The Narrative. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, David Mahan, and we're pleased to welcome in now Megan Basham, who's a culture reporter for the Daily Wire. She's here to talk to us about her new book called Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. She's a frequent contributor to Morning Wire, one of the nation's top 10 news podcasts, and she's also written for a number of notable publications and journals and things like that. And we're so grateful that we get to have her back on the podcast today. Megan, welcome to The Narrative.
Well, I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, now we at The Narrative, we're a top-notch professional organization. We do things by the book. The book that we follow is called Dibs, and Aaron has actually called
I
dibs
called
on
dibs
the first
for this
question
first
today.
I wanted to. I've been looking forward to this book coming out for quite some time, Megan, and have been really grateful for your work over the years. I actually, though, I want to start a little bit higher level on the book because you've been doing a ton of interviews, and I want to drill into some of the specifics in the book too. But you do something with this book that is a tightrope we try to walk at CCV all the time. We were actually just talking about this before we started recording, which was, we had the abortion amendment fight here and did this big exit poll afterwards and saw that 1 out of 3 weekly attending churchgoers voted yes on abortion up to birth. And, at CCV, we have this large church network. And, actually it's something too, Maria and I, my wife and I, we talk a lot about, which is how do what's the appropriate way to criticize the bride of Christ, right? Because there are people that tend to relish, that have built entire industries and platforms off of criticizing the church. Honestly, I've seen it both on the left and the right, right? We've all been at the rallies of folks who are, if only the church would rise up and all this. And, it becomes really easy to bash pastors. But there are times when, again, we see things like 1 out of 3 weekly churchgoers being okay with, tearing apart children limb from limb up until the point of birth in the womb. So as you were writing this book, what were your thoughts going through your mind? And how should we as Christians be thinking about when is it appropriate to criticize the church and how we go about doing that?
Well, one of the things I try to do, and some people have pointed it out as a criticism, but is that I try not to ascribe motives. People said, well, how do you know that this is why a certain church leader or high-level ministry leader did something? You didn't demonstrate that they said that's why they did it. And I really did try to avoid doing that, because if they didn't write down, hey, here's why I did this, I let readers make up their own minds about that. What I could do was show, okay, so these left-wing foundations, here's what their aims are. Here's what they have explicitly stated they are trying to accomplish with this funding that is coming from their organizations and going into evangelical organizations. And my intent was to let that stand for itself. So if they stated their motivations, then you can read that and you can see why they say they are providing this funding. So that was one thing. Another thing was to not pick out a stray statement from a person who maybe didn't put things with the clarity that they could have, but somebody who had a pattern of behavior. So if you saw someone who was sort of consistently bringing in, let's say, the language of critical race theory or the sort of corporate DEI lingo that we're very used to, if that became a regular pattern of how they were approaching the issue of ethnic divisions in the church, then that became fair game, because we weren't talking about a stray comment. We were talking about a pattern of behavior. And then the other thing is, I think when you could see, okay, they were taking a consistent position where they were watering down something like the significance of the sanctity of life to incorporate other issues that may or may not also be very significant, but do not rise to that moral level. That was something worth exploring too, because at that point, you are defending an issue. You're not defending or attacking a person. You're saying this issue of the lives of babies in the womb is worth delineating from something that's a little more muddy, like, is there systemic racism in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was I've seen this criticism come up online sometimes, and we'll have this frankly come at us where we'll call something out. People are like, well, you're just nitpicking. You're just taking, a one-off and running with that. This whole concept in your book of sort of leftist agendas coming into the church. This is not a subtle thing, right? This is not a one-time thing. It's
Right.
a pretty, to use their word, a pretty systematic thing that you've seen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, when you went through the documents from the left-wing funders, they were surprisingly explicit sometimes about why they were doing what they were doing. A lot has been made about my title, Shepherds for Sale, with some people seeming to not understand, and I don't know how sincere this is, but that it could be both figurative and literal. And I do point out in the introduction that I am not saying that every single person that we're going to explore in this book and every institution took a envelope of cash at midnight from George Soros, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. There's different kinds of influence peddling that can happen. And sometimes it's for media adulation. Sometimes it's simply for worldly approval, what the Bible calls fear of man. But it is sometimes for explicit left-wing funding. And to the degree that I explored that, you could actually look at some of these institutions and think tanks, like, for example, New America, which is a Soros and Bill Gates funded think tank that did a post-mortem on why left-wing efforts to infiltrate evangelicals on climate change failed. And that actually is where I took this title. So in their report, they talked about the rent and evangelical model. And so what they were hoping to do was to funnel money into some of these evangelical organizations to influence high-level, high-profile evangelical leaders, and that whatever these evangelical leaders said and the positions that they took, that their influence would then trickle down to the people in the pews. But when I workshopped the title a little bit, Evangelicals for Rent, a lot of friends and family went, that's confusing, it's clunky. And so that's how we ended up simplifying to Shepherds for Sale. But it goes to exactly what you're talking about right there.
Well, I just want to read this short section from the introduction here that makes that point. And I'm going to do it a little bit out of order, but the president and CEO of Atlantic Philanthropies at the time was Gara LaMarche. I think I'm saying that right.
Mm-hmm.
A man who has spent his entire career hopping from one elite leftist donor group to another. He had previously served as the director of U.S. programs for George Soros's Open Society Foundations. And in a report they'd put out, they wrote, quote, "Organized religion is at the heart of LGBTI oppression and needs to be deconstructed." The report went on to say an engagement needs to come from groups within the churches to change this. The report advised LGBTI organizations need to appropriate Christian values for a progressive rights agenda.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not. This is not some slight a hand or handful of groups that are just posting online. And again, if you take the Soros tie, we saw them pour tens of millions of dollars into Ohio last year to pass the abortion amendment. Just a month ago, they poured $6 million directly from the 1630 fund into another Ohio constitutional amendment to change our redistricting process. That, in total, $23 million into Ohio, just on a redistricting amendment, right? So these are the types of things when we start talking about this topic and start talking about things like George Soros, a lot of folks will say, "Oh, you're conspiracy theories, or you're nitpicking, or you're picking off these one-offs." But no, this is really the largest political force at work in America today, and of course they would have it just would make sense that they would have a very specific strategy to target the church.
It reminds me a lot, Megan, of just the abortion industry, and going all the way back to Margaret Sanger, and having to get some of the Black pastors to adopt this message so that we would kill ourselves versus doing it Hitler's way, right, and just going in with camps. So we know that this is the way the enemy works, and I guess my concern with all of it is, and thank you so much for this work. It is vitally important. But to get to where Aaron started us off, I know the enemy works a couple ways. And in the book of Daniel, it tells us that he comes in to speak against the Most High, right? And I think that's what a lot of the church sees very clearly is when folks will just come out and just take out God from their political platform, or just completely speak against God, his people, and his principles, his plan. But then there's a second way that the enemy comes, and that's to wear down the saints of the Most High. There's this overt way, right? But then there's a covert strategy to infiltrate the church, right? To be an angel of light and to slowly just beat them down and cause them to not be effective soldiers or saints for the Most High. And sometimes, like when I first looked at your title, I thought, well, this could be taken in a way that would say, okay, I'm tired of just getting beat up. I'm getting beat up on one side, getting beat up on the other. And so for me, the effective communication piece of all of these strategies to, number one, oppose the enemy, but also not wear out the saints, that could be a very difficult balance to have. And I've listened to some of your interviews, and I know you're a journalist, and you just say, listen, it's for me to uncover the facts, lay them out there, and you all need to do something with it. But are you cognizant of this strain that sometimes our strategies can put on the body?
Yeah, very much. Particularly as I knew I was entering a media landscape, a publishing landscape where the church has been minutely dissected and disparaged a lot. It's become a cottage industry, even to have these articles and these books that are critiquing the church for alleged Christian nationalism, for patriarchy, for all of these things. Now, largely they have been coming from the left. And I did want to be cognizant that I didn't want to write a right-wing version of that. And that was part of why I ended with my testimony, because I felt like I didn't want to just feel like I'm beating up on failures that I see in leadership, though I do see failures in leadership. But it was also to ideally remind leadership that here's who you could be missing if you take up these priorities of the secular left and of the world, and you bring this sort of social activism into the church on issues that are not biblically clear, as opposed to issues that are unequivocally moral issues. You could be leaving people like the wretched sinner that I was on the roadside. And so I wanted to speak to them in that and say, I am so grateful for the church that when I became a Christian, I had a sound, solid church that confronted me on my sin, that challenged me in sanctification, and that brought me along, because I think I would literally have died without it. And so there's such a gratitude there. And I wanted to reflect that love of the church, that I'm not here to tear down the church. And it was why I very explicitly said, in no way am I saying that hierarchy is bad, or that authority structures are bad, or that having people in authority over you is bad, that we need all of those things. We just need it to be done in such a way that itself is subject to the priorities of Scripture.
Yeah, I gotta say, Megan, like to the personal testimony side here, that's why I was so excited about your book, because I think Maria and I very much rode the roller coaster with some of the folks in your book, right? I think in particular about Tim Keller. I think about Matt Chandler, Russell Moore, who was a dear friend. Flashing back 10, 15 years ago, these were folks that I very much held in high regard. And I have to be honest, a lot of Tim Keller's work on prayer and a lot of his theological work, I still very much hold in high regard. But we leaned in to a lot of their talk about, especially on issues like immigration or issues like refugees and even on Islam and things like that, and said, okay, well, we'll walk alongside you and follow your lead here. And it really was for us both and especially like all culminating, I'll say, in 2016 with the election of President Trump. And you document this really well in your book, especially in regards to Russell Moore, where there was this big push. Evangelicals can't vote for for Donald Trump because he's a liar and he's not going to hold up these issues and he's going to be worse than Clinton. And then even after Donald Trump comes in and actually holds to his word on these key issues, I'm always one to say, I'll get frustrated at some evangelical leaders that want to like hold up Donald Trump as like this ultimate Christian leader. And it's like, guys, you don't need to do that in order to justify voting for him, right? Like you could say, listen, he's better than the other one. He's going to uphold these policies. We don't need to baptize Donald Trump every time we want to justify voting for the man.
But if we can baptize him, that'd be good.
If we can too, by all means, if you want to pray for him and all that, but
sprinkling, whatever.
But for me, the break point with a lot of these guys in especially after that 2016 election was after he did all of these great things. And you really documented here after the Dobbs case came down and all of these folks who so vehemently opposed Donald Trump and condemned Christians who voted for him still could not bring themselves to say, oh, I was wrong. Right. Or maybe not even I was wrong for not voting for him, just to say, wow, this is really good. I mean, at the very least. And obviously COVID and a lot of the BLM stuff, and you talk about this in the book as well, we'll get to it, highlighted that too. But all of that was such an exposing moment of what was really going on with these leaders. And it's heartbreaking because, again, like some of these folks were friends, and it's difficult to see, where they've led us,
Yeah. And I read a piece that a friend of mine wrote, and he actually wrote it years ago. But his point was when you're confronted with something, because we are all fallible in many ways, where you have gotten something wrong and you see it there that I overstated this or I missed something that other people saw. You have a choice. You can either acknowledge I got this wrong and give credit where it's due, or you have to double down. And if you double down, you are continuing in a pattern of folly that is going to lead you to more folly. And it's going to just ground you further in a lack of sense and wisdom in the direction that you're heading. And I mean, I know he's a familiar figure here in my book and in general conversation, but it's hard not to look at someone like David French and not see how that has played out. So he went from being a credible, never Trump critic, I think, where people went, okay, yeah, I think, I agree. He's definitely a flawed man. People made their political calculations regarding that. But then as time went on, it just became so much more vitriolic about evangelicals who did not see that question of whether or not to vote for Donald Trump in the same way he did, to the point now that we saw him this week openly endorsing Kamala Harris. And we're talking about the most pro-abortion candidate that this nation has ever known, someone who opposed the protection of infants born alive. And I think that so illustrated my friend's essay that it just continually compounded a folly so that it got to a point where we don't recognize this person anymore. And that was kind of what I was exploring in this, is that if you cannot, and my guess is it's partly pride, out of pride, acknowledge I missed something here, then you're going to continue to go down a road that is just compounding foolishness.
Yeah, and the point of his op-ed was that he was voting for Kamala to save conservatism, which
Right.
which is just stunning to me as I read through that. Like, wow, that is quite the stretch that we have to vote for this incredibly liberal candidate in order to save conservatism.
Right. Yeah.
How about saving babies? I mean,
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Right. And that David French is a great example of that. And I'll say too, I think one of the things that your book really ties into, and this is why I loved starting with the Open Society Foundation and the really systematic and well-funded effort to corrupt the church, however you want to go about talking about these things. To me, a great example of this, to the what you just told again from a just sort of personal experience. 2018, there was a big ballot initiative in Ohio to decriminalize drug possession, basically take us down the Oregon path. And we opposed it here at CCV, and we fought it. We thank God we beat it. But one of the things that was coming out on it was, there was this big push inside the church on, well, we really need to have a conversation around criminal justice reform. That was the big buzz phrase, and even like going through your book was just sort of a trip down memory lane of all of the hot button issues that the media was sticking a microphone in front of our face saying, so what do you think about criminal justice reform? What do you think about Muslims? What do you think about Me Too? What do you think about, COVID? What do you think about, and now we don't talk about, and you just sort of move on to the next thing. But this was a classic example of the church being pressed into, and all these groups coming into Ohio, trying to get pastors to sign on to this pledge for criminal justice reform. Well, then, and I said at CCV, hey, we're going to take a look at this after we beat this amendment. We'll have a conversation. Well, after we beat it, I got a call from a friend who was working in the Department of Corrections here in Ohio in DeWine's administration, and asked to sit down with us because he said, hey, before you guys jump in on this, I just want to show you some stuff. And he walked through basically the actual numbers in Ohio of people incarcerated. And he said, there is nobody in Ohio today that is in prison for having a dime bag of marijuana on them, for just, or even just having general possession of weed. Right. That's just not something that we don't do that. Right. And there was this big narrative being pushed out that our prisons were bursting at the seams because our police forces, who, by the way, predominantly are controlled by Democrat administrations in the inner cities where most of these crimes happen, are just going out looking to arrest people. That just wasn't happening. But there was this narrative being pushed that our prisons were chock full of folks like this. And we eventually, I came out with and said, listen, we're not touching this criminal justice reform stuff, because there was a movement. And again, not to say that there aren't areas that we can improve our system. By all means, we should always be looking to do that. But the narrative that had been built of this over aggressive police force and over aggressive judiciary looking to lock people up just wasn't true. And at a certain point, you have to be able to step back and say that's not what's happening.
Yeah, and that was kind of what I wanted to do in that pro-life chapter, because the immediate reaction of so many of the well-known evangelical leaders who had been never Trump to the overturning of Roe was to go to the social safety net argument. Well, now we need to step up, church, and start taking care of mothers and babies. And, I spoke to women who were running pro-life crisis pregnancy centers, and they're like, hold up, we do so much. It's insane how much we do. The fact that these centers, not counting churches, normal crisis pregnancy centers, outnumber abortion clinics 3-1 is significant. And it was discounting all of that work.
Oh, no, I literally, Megan, I underlined that sentence. Is page 55. The step-up response of which Karen Swallow Pryor and Russell Moore were only two high-profile examples, especially irked Cross, this woman who worked in pregnancy centers. She knew firsthand not just the vast amounts of effort pro-life Christians were expending to care for moms and babies, but also the significant financial investment they were making. Honestly, that was Maria, volunteers at David's wife's pregnancy center. And you go to the March for Life, and it's probably a third high school students and then a third pregnancy center care volunteers or workers.
Yeah.
Right? Like the vast majority of the pro-life movement is in the pregnancy center space. And so this idea of like, oh, we need to step up and really care for these women now. Like, what do you think we've been doing for 40 plus years at this point? I mean, that like,
Right.
it was the thing that always annoyed me from the legislative side is people said, oh, well, we need to really highlight the work we're doing listen, in Ohio, we advocate for $10 to $15 million a year going to pregnancy centers. The media never writes about it, right? They don't talk about it. Like we do all of these things to support, prenatal care, all this stuff. Literally you can get everything you need for free for having a baby at a pregnancy center. And they don't, they don't write about it. So it's not a lack of effort on that front.
Yeah. And I think there's an element too of like what the local churches are doing. If we yes, we need to be aware of what these big evangelical leaders or these big platforms are teaching to pastors that are looking somewhere for guidance and information on these really complex issues. But I know, much like you were saying, Aaron, of kind of breaking up with some of these people who were really influential in your own development. I know around like probably 18 or 19 for me, there was just something that was disquieting to me about listening to Greer and Keller and Chandler regularly. And I still respect those guys immensely. And I would certainly turn to some of their works if I needed some guidance and direction, but I couldn't quite put a finger on it. And for me, it was really just more landed on, I'm part of a local church,
right?
And my local church is responsible for my discipleship, and I want to invest in that, not spend my time listening to a bunch of podcast feeds and stuff like that when I can be fed by my own local church. So I think it's in some ways it's the same thing with the local pregnancy resource centers. Like you don't understand what's going on at the micro level, but you've got to be aware of how that micro level is being influenced on the macro.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask Megan, this goes back to the bigger question we were talking, we sort of led off with on, how should we go about criticizing or critiquing the church broadly? Why is it so important today to name names, right? And this is something we think about here a lot, right? We don't do it lightly when we talk about someone's name, but I know a lot of Christian leaders still kind of refuse to, in their editorials or op-eds, to say someone's name if they've seen something be pushed out. Why did you feel like it was so important in this book to name names?
Part of it was to overcome the argument that has been proffered frequently from a lot of the institutions that we don't actually have a problem, that there's just some actors in the church who are divisive or they're grumblers. And you did hear that a lot, particularly, when the flashpoint hit of 2020, where I think a number of things converged that made people realize, oh, we have a problem in the church. One was the reaction to COVID, where issues that should have been matters of personal liberty were sort of tortured with spiritual language into this legalism of you must view these issues this way to be obedient to Christ. And then the reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement that summer and the marches and the riots we saw, that people really realized, okay, something is wrong. And yet in the leadership class, there was such an unwillingness to acknowledge it. And even as we got further away from it, to say, well, look, it's not charitable to talk about what happened during those couple of years. And the problem is that suggests that the next issue that comes up like that is going to be handled the exact same way. So I needed to demonstrate that this stuff was real, and we needed to demonstrate it through what was said, what the actions were, and also to serve as a warning going forward that in terms of influence peddling, here's whose influence was harnessed. Now, whether they did it explicitly because they got involved with this left-wing funded organization and received elite fellowships and a lot of media notice, that's for them to say. But this is what happened, and that we can then see that, okay, in Jude, we are told you need to look out for these people who are bringing unbiblical influences into the church. And we can't do that contending if we're not specific about how it happened. And I think also we have a biblical model of that. When we see the Apostle Paul opposing Peter, I mean, he was writing this letter. He didn't have to say, I opposed Peter to his face. He could have said, I had a disagreement with another apostle, and this is what it was about. But we resolved this. And, he realized that he was wrong. Paul didn't just name Peter. He also named Barnabas and said, even Barnabas was taken in by this. And it wasn't to say, these two men are not believers. They're not my brothers. They're apostates. He wasn't saying that. He was saying, even men of this stature can be taken in by this worldly, unbiblical ideology. And in a lesser point, we even saw him do it with those who were not Christians, but were causing trouble in the church. Like there's a moment when Paul says, that Alexander the coppersmith who's been causing me problems.
Yeah.
So we see Paul repeatedly being pretty specific about who he's talking about.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think from our perspective on this, there's the reality is there's more information than ever before. People have their individuals that they kind of follow. And it doesn't feel like we're doing a service to the church if we're not having the conversation about, hey, look, this, I think a great example of this is some of Andy Stanley's stuff, right? And you talk about Andy in the book. And his everything from decoupling the Old Testament to the New Testament to his very slick ways of going about really undermining a biblical perspective on sexuality, especially homosexuality. He's not come right out and gone, full Matthew Vines per se, right? And at times has still sort of upheld that he is, maintaining a biblical perspective on these things, but then has in private with, as you documented here in the book, in private with leaders, bolstered up the LGBT movement and things like that. And again, I for us with whatever platform we have here, we feel an obligation to say, hey, church, be aware that these forces are at play. And I think for us, a lot of folks just don't generally know.
So Megan, for me and for our listeners who may not follow a lot of what you're doing, because I know it's not just this book. You've been uncovering this stuff for a long time, but you use the analogy of commerce, right? And I know it's not, like you said, George Soros coming and writing checks to pastors, but it does evoke thoughts of just ideas of marketing, ideas of people being incentivized and people being sold, and there's purchasers, right, of those that are being sold. So what does that look like? For the average person, what does that look like for shepherds, to be purchased?
So I will give you there's a number of chapters where I sort of lay out the pattern, and I'll give you one. So if we want to stick with George Soros and Open Society, what we can see is that really starting around 2010, his organization started to openly say, okay, we're running into a problem with getting our policy preferences across the finish line. And our big problem is religious Americans. And religious life is not going to go away in this country. So how do we harness the power of that? And so they wrote about making grants to influential people of faith. So that was where that started. And then we look at an issue that was important to Open Society, like immigration. So they are for lax border policies. They have backed a number of policies that border hawks would be against. And so they wanted to draft the church into that effort. So what we see then is an organization that is a secular organization, the National Immigration Forum. It, in its first few years of existence, was overwhelmingly funded by George Soros and still takes funding from him, I believe. At least the last time I checked, it's 990s. In 2021, it still was. And it also gets funding from other left-wing organizations. So they realized, okay, we need to bring evangelicals into this project. So what they did was they got together with a well-known and trusted evangelical institution, the National Association for Evangelicals, and said, let's create a subgroup within the National Immigration Forum that is going to specifically target conservative evangelicals. And that was the Evangelical Immigration Table. So that is then set up. Legally, there is no separation between the National Immigration Forum and the Evangelical Immigration Table. But publicly, those two organizations are not acknowledged to be essentially the same organization. So you can look at this as an AstroTurf campaign. So once the EIT, the Evangelical Immigration Table, is set up, it then begins drafting in other well-known evangelical leaders to come in and sign on to a general statement of principles. And it tends to be things that all of us would agree with. Things like immigrants, whether legal or illegal, are made in the image of God. We all agree with that. Immigrants coming across our border, we want to share the gospel with them. We agree with that. We agree that they should be treated humanely. So all of these high-profile evangelical institutions and leaders then sign on to this general statement of principles. That statement of principles is then used to go and lobby for specific legislation. So one of the examples I give is in 2015, it would have been the McCain-Schumer Gang of Eight bill. So that was a bill that would have granted legal status to up to 11 million illegal immigrants for a fine of up to $1,000, so potentially less than $1,000, which is a pretty low bar to have broken America's laws to come into the country and would arguably incentivize illegal immigration a lot more. So this general statement of principles put out by this AstroTurf group that was created by a George Soros funded organization and that itself received some George Soros funding to do some of its work, a program. I'm getting deep in the weeds here, so hang with me.
No, this is important. Yeah.
Yeah, to a program called Bibles, Badges, and Business that was specifically designed to target conservative voters. So that program is then put into action, and it drafts mobilizers, some of whom are pastors. And the work that they do is these pastors working for the Evangelical Immigration Table, but really for the National Immigration Forum, then have these set goals to do things like recruit more pastors to sign on to the Statement of Principles and to set meetings between pastors and local conservative lawmakers, state and national lawmakers as well, to convince them, hey, Mr. GOP lawmaker who knows that the evangelical voting bloc is your most important constituency and you're not going to win an election without them, you need to vote for this border bill that will legalize a lot of people who are here illegally and incentivize further illegal immigration, because if you don't, you might lose your next election. So that's kind of how the whole system works.
And for those of you who might be thinking, wow, this sounds big and out there, and you know, is this really happening? You guys will remember about a year ago we had, or maybe it was 10 months ago, we had Laura Reese from the Heritage Foundation on to talk about what was happening at the border. And the week after we posted that podcast, I had 2 emails in my inbox, one from a pastor and one from the head of the Evangelical Immigration Table in Ohio, asking for a meeting with us because they heard the podcast. They really wanted to just have a conversation with us about this. And they were organizing in the state. I mean, this is happening here. It is a significant effort going on. And this is why I say I'm applauding what you're doing here, because it is a new day and age. We need to understand what time it is in America, and we need to expose what's being done because people are being drawn into it. I mean, I remember when the Evangelical Immigration Table came out back in 2015, and you looked at that list, and again, having just come off of what they were so wise about was that was right after the Nashville statement had come out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this really strong statement from evangelical leaders, folks like Denny Burke and Russell Moore and John Piper and all of these folks. So a bunch of great leaders were a part of this Nashville statement that was putting out a statement on abortion and sexuality, right? All things that were rock solid. All these guys signed it. I signed it. It was awesome. Well, then around that same time, the Evangelical Immigration Table came out, and not all of the people who signed the Nashville statement, but a number of the leaders who had signed that also signed on to the Evangelical Immigration Table. And I was like, oh, okay. So, and it frankly was an issue, immigration, I hadn't thought a lot about. Thankfully, I never actually signed on to this one, but it was like, oh, these are friendly people. Let's hear what they have to say. And that association strategy that they worked was very effective, and has continued to be very effective for them, but is beginning to be exposed more and more. So I got one last thing that I want to ask, but fellas, you got anything else here? Because I want to end on COVID, but anything else that you guys want to hit?
I'd just like to say, from my own perspective, having flipped through the book, Megan, one thing that I really found it to be a benefit for is just general discernment around these issues. And certainly you mentioned in the introduction as well that many of us are under faithful pastors and in faithful churches. And we don't want necessarily for our listeners to think, oh no, this is definitely affecting my pastor who seems like such a rock solid guy. But at the same time, there are these things that it gives us a rubric or some language that we can keep an ear out for and just be wise and check it against the authority of Scripture. And I'm very thankful for your work in that sense.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad you noticed that, because I feel like some of the conversation around it is suggesting that it's a much more polemical, vitriolic book than it is. Which, so I'll just say, read it and see what you think, because certainly I love the church and
Buy
I love
it and read it,
pastors.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Right. So, part of what I was really wanting to tell people is, hey, the stuff I'm writing about, don't use this as an excuse to not be in church, and be in church. There's a lot of faithful pastors. There's a lot of faithful churches. Be in one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that I think actually this is why I wanted to end on the COVID conversation, because this gets to some of the lessons from the book of like where do we rebuild from here? And because again, we're talking about this conversation right now along the abortion amendment, right? We need to rebuild a culture of life. If we hope to one day repeal this abortion amendment, we have a lot of work to do. First and foremost, just in the church, right? We use the Ezra Nehemiah analogy all the time around Ohio now, which is, before Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, Ezra rebuilt the temple, right? So before we can hope to restore a culture of life in Ohio, we've got to do that in the church. And COVID I think COVID has so many important lessons for us. In particular, what happened with Francis Collins, what's still in many ways still happening with Francis Collins. But what are the big lessons when you see what Francis Collins did around, first and foremost, stifling honest conversation about the origins of COVID, and attacking people who were trying to engage in that conversation, but then also really, again, building out, hiring folks to go push the vax in churches and in evangelical and Catholic spaces. What are the lessons that the church, now that a lot of this is out there, for the most part, it doesn't seem. What's fascinating to me about what a lot of folks are doing with COVID, the whole COVID situation, is they're not even really disputing the facts anymore. They're just saying either one, it wasn't a big deal, or two, you can't blame us because people were dying. We were just trying to do our best, all of that kind of stuff. But there were some pretty significant things that were not just said, but harms that were done during that period.
Right.
What are the lessons you think the church should learn from this whole experience we had with the COVID-19 issue?
Well, there's a number of them. Obviously, it was such a huge topic. One, when I think about Francis Collins, and I don't have this verse memorized off the top of my head, but there's a proverb, a warning against providing surety for a friend, because you could get burned and your credit could be damaged. And I look at what happened with Francis Collins, that so many people put their credibility on the line for him very thoughtlessly, because these were people who knew his background. They knew the positions he had taken regarding promoting, not just, it wasn't just something that happened under his watch, but promoting continued research into fetal cells and fetal tissue and aborted baby parts. I mean, that was something that he pushed for and opposed the Trump administration when it was trying to scale that back. So that's one. And then, the other moral issues around Francis Collins declaring himself an LGBTQ ally and spearheading these initiatives that included transgender research on children, giving kids cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, mastectomies. This was stuff that our government was funding. So at the outset, I would have said there should have been a caution about lending your credibility as a Christian leader to this government official, especially knowing what our government was involved in. I mean, I think it would have been not great if Francis Collins had just been someone who happened to be in leadership when these things were going on, but in fact, he was much more active in it than that. So that's one. And then two, as these situations were unfolding, people were staking out positions of assurance, and they were telling people, we know that this is a conspiracy theory. For example, that the virus leaked from a Wuhan lab, when that was a very much unfolding situation in flux, and there should have been a lot more humility about, hey, we don't really know what's true. And this immediate instinct to trust whatever's coming out of Washington, D.C. should have been checked. And I don't know where that impulse has come from in the last 10 years, this whole misinformation, disinformation. I'm going to call it an obsession of people policing the discourse and policing the ideas. I want to say that that is not a pastoral role to say, hey, I know that what was coming out of Washington, D.C. was accurate. Well, we can't know that. And, that is why we're cautioned. Whoever states his case first seems right until someone else comes along and examines it. And that examination process is important. So to sort of spiritually gaslight people into saying it's somehow unchristian to allow that process to take place was a pretty big error in our Christian institutions and leadership. So I think that's the other part of this. And then the third part is just the legalism that we saw. Something like an experimental vaccine, that it was reasonable for people to say, I don't know if I want to get this yet. And there was nothing wrong with people who did want to get it either. We can say that. But for those who might be young men, when there was early evidence coming out that they were particularly susceptible to heart issues with this vaccine, or young women who were of childbearing age and maybe trying to get pregnant, or they just didn't know how it could impact their fertility, and they wanted to be cautious. Those were reasonable points for people to say, this is a matter of personal conscience, and we are going to leave that between you and the Holy Spirit. Instead, we saw actual statements, love your neighbor, get the shot, that were being circulated by evangelical leaders saying, if you are being obedient to Christ, you're going to get this shot. And not only that, you are going to police the misinformation around this shot that just came out. And we know that we don't have all the information yet because there hasn't been time for that kind of long-term study to be done. So those are the kind of things that I think we need to look back on, that you as a church leader do not need to stake a firm position on something where it's not clear and where the Bible doesn't speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's, for me, the word that I keep coming back to after COVID is steadfastness.
Mm-hmm.
And the concept of being slow to speak. I think, as we kind of alluded to earlier, the pressure right now on pastors, and Christians generally, but in particular pastors, to, this just happened. What's the hot take? What's the position that we have to have? And I'll confess to being swept up in that at times, and instead slowing down and acknowledging, okay, it's okay to take time and say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's one of the big lessons that came out of this book, bigger than just, okay, these leaders I need to be wary of. I think that's an important thing for us to know. But I think on the personal level, I think some of the folks in the book that are named got swept up, right? And I think the question for us to look at is, one, when have I found myself being swept up, maybe one way or the other, right? And two, how do I make sure that I don't allow that to happen in the future? And I think it's a great service you did here, Megan, and appreciate, obviously, to not just write this book, but then have receipts on it is not an easy task. So while also being a mom and a reporter, grateful for the work you did here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate y'all having me.
Yeah, the book is Shepherds for Sale. I'm assuming anybody can get it wherever they get books. It's
Yeah,
pretty much
yeah,
widely available.
all the retailers.
Yep, great. And where can our listeners follow you and your work, Megan?
I'm on Twitter at I guess X. I'm on X at Meg Basham. I'm on Instagram at journalist Megan Basham. And you can always find me at dailywire.com and on Morning Wire podcast.
Well, great. Megan, again, thanks so much for your time, and we appreciate your work.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.